Three-stage developmental vulnerability model from borderline personality disorder to life trajectory analysis part 2, number 1690, VPT 136, June 20, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Psychology and Life Trajectory. Pivot points and trajectory changes. Another interesting observation involves developmental pivot points. Life trajectories do not always change gradually. Sometimes major transitions occur. CASA demonstrated pivot points where developmental strain accelerated. CASA had to pivoting. Periods: ages 21 to 40 and 41 to 60. Case B demonstrated pivot points associated with psychotherapy, emotional support through marriage, and stable relationships that altered the direction of the life trajectory. Case B had to pivoting periods, ages 11 to 20 and 41 to 50. Case C showed zero evidence of any pivoting period. These observations suggest that human development is dynamic rather than static. The direction of a life trajectory may change when sufficiently powerful developmental energies, generated by the interaction between TSIBPD and its three input stressors, create new developmental trajectories. VMT energy contribution ratios. These viscoplastic energy concentration ratios provide additional insight into the developmental mechanisms underlying these three different cases. In CASA, the original childhood abandonment injury 37% remained active throughout life and was continuously reinforced by maladaptive adult behaviors and painful interpersonal experiences. As a result, adulthood contributed the largest share of accumulated VMT energy, 44%. Indicating that the original developmental vulnerability was repeatedly amplified rather than repaired. In Case B, substantial developmental vulnerability originated from childhood abandonment 43% and an adverse adolescent environment 41%. However, stable marriage, long-term emotional support, and psychotherapy substantially reduced the influence of adulthood, lowering its contribution to only 16% of total VMT energy. This pattern suggests that adulthood functioned as a corrective force that partially repaired the original developmental injury and altered the life trajectory. In Case C, no developmental vulnerability was present, resulting in an even one-third distribution among the three developmental stages and a near zero accumulated VMT energy. This balanced pattern suggests a stable developmental process without any significant amplification or reinforcement from any particular life stage. Together, these three cases suggest that adulthood can function either as an amplifier or a dampener of earlier developmental injury, thereby influencing the long-term life trajectory of personality development. From BPD to life trajectory. At the beginning of this project, my focus was BPD. However, by the end of the analysis, the central question had shifted and become much broader. The most important question was no longer, does this person have BPD? Instead, the question became, how much influence does developmental vulnerability exert across an entire human life trajectory? CASA demonstrates developmental vulnerability influencing nearly the entire life trajectory. It is a sad case and a sad story. Case B demonstrates developmental vulnerability influencing only part of the life trajectory, primarily during the pre-adult stages, because later corrective forces alter its direction, mainly through a supportive marital partner and 8 years of psychotherapy. It is a sad story, but it also demonstrates the possibility of recovery and change. Case C demonstrates no meaningful developmental damages or influences from BPD-related vulnerabilities. This case also illustrates the importance of secure attachment and the absence of abandonment during early childhood. Viewed from this perspective, BPD becomes the starting point of inquiry rather than the final destination. The larger subject becomes human development across 7 decades, viewed through 3 carefully selected cases. Conclusion: this study proposes a simple developmental vulnerability framework consisting of 3 interacting forces: attachment, security, environmental stability, and continuity, and reinforcement or repair through significant relationships. These 3 influential forces are represented mathematically by TSIBPD equals A times B times C divided by 10. Application of this math physics framework to 3 representative cases demonstrates 3 distinctly different outcomes: persistent lifetime influence, partial repair through neuroplastic adaptation, and minimal developmental influence. The central purpose of this study is not to classify personality disorders. Rather, it is to understand how developmental vulnerabilities, environmental conditions, and later string love and care relationships interact to shape an individual's life trajectory across 7 decades. Ultimately, BPD served as the entry point, life trajectory became the destination. EclaireMD's study of psychology has been largely self-directed and observation-based, much like in later study of medicine. Over 3 decades, I observed human behavior in families, workplaces, friendships, humanitarian settings, and clinical environments while integrating those observations with extensive reading of over 300 psychology books and frequent self-reflection. The purpose of this article is not to challenge existing psychological frameworks. Rather, it is an attempt to examine human development through a longitudinal lens from the perspective of a non-professionally trained psychologist. By focusing on trajectories instead of isolated symptoms, I hope to better understand how attachment, environment, relationships, neuroplasticity, physiology, and cumulative life experiences interact to influence the direction of a human life over many decades. Among the 3 cases examined in this study, Case B may be the most informative and distinguished. Case A represents a severe and persistent developmental trajectory in which early childhood injury continued to influence the individual's entire life. Case C represents the opposite extreme, a very healthy developmental trajectory with no evidence of any significant psychological injury or accumulated developmental strain. In contrast, Case B occupies the middle ground between these 2 extremes. What makes Case B particularly interesting is that it demonstrates the possibility of life trajectory change. The individual began life with developmental vulnerabilities, primarily related to abandonment damage, that were in many ways comparable to those observed in Case A. However, and like Case A, the trajectory did not remain fixed. Through a combination of psychotherapy, a stable long-term marital relationship, emotional support, and a more secure adult environment, the developmental strain gradually declined over time. The original injury was not completely eliminated, but its influence was substantially reduced. For this reason, I view Case B as a hybrid life trajectory. It is neither a complete failure nor a complete recovery. Rather, it represents a fortunate redirection of life. The early decades were marked by significant adversity, but later decades introduced corrective forces that altered the direction of the trajectory. Based on my personal observations and non-professional judgments, it is reasonable to estimate that approximately 40% to 50% of the original psychological burden was repaired. The significance of Case B extends beyond BPD itself. It demonstrates that developmental vulnerability is not necessarily destiny. Early injuries matter, but later relationships also matter. A loving spouse, a stable family environment, trusted friendships, and effective psychotherapy may not completely erase childhood wounds, but they can substantially influence the course of a person's life. In this sense, Case B serves as an important reminder that while the past shapes the trajectory, it does not always determine the final destination. Case B is similar to my own life trajectory. I spent the first 4 decades of my life studying mathematics, physics, and engineering, and then shifted my focus to psychology and pathophysiology for nearly 3 decades. On the surface, these fields appear unrelated. However, both have enriched my life journey. Furthermore, I have learned that psychology and pathophysiology are closely connected, representing 2 different aspects of human health and disease. Afterthoughts: as I completed this study, I gradually realized that my original interest in borderline personality disorder was only the starting point of the investigation. The deeper question was not whether a person met the diagnostic criteria for BPD. The deeper question was how an early developmental vulnerability might influence the trajectory of an entire human life. Over the years, I have observed hundreds of individuals whose childhood experiences continued to influence their relationships, decisions, emotional responses, and overall life satisfaction decades later. In some cases, the burden appeared to remain active throughout life. In other cases, the influence gradually weakened through psychotherapy, stable relationships, personal growth, and supportive environments. In still other cases, the developmental vulnerability appeared minimal from the beginning, allowing the individual to follow a relatively stable life path. This observation was one of the motivations behind selecting 3 representative trajectories in this study. Rather than focusing on a single case, I wanted to compare 3 different outcomes: persistent lifelong influence, partial recovery, and minimal influence. The comparison allowed me to view developmental vulnerability not as a fixed diagnosis but as a dynamic process evolving across many decades. As a mathematician, physicist, and engineer, I naturally tend to search for measurable variables and quantitative relationships. Modern Medicine already relies heavily on first-tier biomarkers and quantitative measurements, including blood pressure, glucose, body weight, kidney function, and many other physiological indicators. Psychology, however, often deals with phenomena that are more difficult to quantify. My intention was not to reduce human behavior to a simple equation. Rather, I wanted to explore whether a simple quantitative framework could help visualize developmental trajectories that otherwise remain largely qualitative. The numerical values used in this study should therefore be viewed as approximations rather than precise measurements. Their purpose is not to establish exact psychological scores. Their purpose is to make long-term patterns visible, once developmental factors are expressed quantitatively. The resulting trajectories begin to reveal patterns and differences that are difficult to detect through narrative description alone. Much like the traditional approaches used in many branches of medicine, what impressed me most was not the individual scores themselves, but the shapes of the trajectories. As shown in the attached figure, the severe case A demonstrated a prolonged plateau of accumulated developmental strain stress energy that persisted across much of adult life. The partially recovered case B showed a gradual decline in strain after the introduction of psychotherapy and stable long-term relationships. The healthy reference case C remained relatively flat throughout the lifespan. These three patterns closely match what I have observed in real life. Perhaps the most important lesson from this study is that childhood experiences matter greatly, but they do not necessarily determine the final outcome or ultimate destiny. Human beings retain a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Just as neuroplasticity allows the brain to reorganize after physical injury from a stroke, long-term emotional experiences may gradually modify psychological pathways over time. The trajectory may not be completely rewritten, but its direction can change. Ultimately, this article is not really about BPD alone. BPD served as the entry point. The larger subject became the study of human life trajectories. My goal was to explore how attachment, environment, relationships, adaptation, and neuroplasticity interact over 7 decades to shape the direction of a human life, whether viewed through the lens of psychology, neuroscience, medicine, or engineering. I believe that understanding the trajectory is often more informative than examining a few single still snapshots. In the end, the question that interests me most is not simply what condition a person has today. The question is how that person arrived there, what forces influence the journey, and how the trajectory may continue to evolve in the years ahead. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to T. The author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.